Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. And it is great to have everyone here who is in the chat. And welcome, especially that I didn't even know this until this morning when I saw Shannon Q post it, but happy International Atheist Day. And I am very pleased that for International Atheist Day, I have on not an atheist, but a theist. And so everyone say hello to the Dry Apologist.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming. I do appreciate the fact that you did come. A lot of people that I have invited to the show, they'll talk a big talk, and as soon as I invite them on the show, suddenly they back out. And so it is difficult. And I also want you to know that I do appreciate the position that you're in, because um, I don't intend this to be mean-spirited in any way. But on the other hand, you will find that the people in the chat will not agree with you, because most of the people watching the show are people who follow me on a regular basis, and most of them are atheists. There are a couple of theists that do watch on a somewhat regular basis. You might find Otangelo. Do you know Otangelo?
I don't think so.
Okay, he might show up. There's also a guy that goes by the name of Firewire on on Twitter that sometimes watches me, and he's a theist also. So if he shows up, he will definitely support you. But the vast majority of the people will not be in support of you. So I do appreciate what you are doing, and I do appreciate how brave it was of you to come on here. So first, let's start out by letting you tell people a little bit about yourself and about your channel and what it is you do and what position you're coming from.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So I have an apologetics channel, of course, and I've done live streams and some debates on there, but lately I've just been doing a lot of short videos, but I've debated on a number of different channels. So, and I'm a Roman Catholic, so that's going to be my perspective. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it, unless you want me to go into my position on this topic. Or...
Sure. Well, let's go ahead and do that. The topic that we have for today is, oh gosh, I even forgot what it was. Is salvation a choice of free will? And so, yeah, what is your position on is salvation a choice of free will?
Yeah. So I do hold to a free will position. So I'm not a Calvinist. There are different Catholic positions, but Catholics will, but working alongside God's grace and predestination, but there are different interpretations of that. But yeah, I definitely think that we have the free will to accept God's grace or reject it. But yeah, so that's basically my position. Yeah.
Okay. And from your position, how does one attain salvation?
Yeah, so that's complicated because so the general Catholic position, of course, is going to be both the hope that somebody becomes a Catholic and is baptized and remains in a state of grace, but the church does recognize there are people that maybe don't become Catholic or even Christian or even theists through no fault of their own, and as long as that person is seeking truth and doing the best that they can, it is possible still for them to be saved if it's through no fault of their own. We ultimately don't know who's going to be saved for sure. So I wouldn't say, I know this person's not saved. I know this person is saved. I think people do the best or should do the best that they can. But ultimately, I do think it's a good thing to become Catholic. I do encourage people to, but that doesn't, secure your salvation. It ultimately is how you respond to God's grace. So.
I'm going to put our conversation on hold for just a moment
Okay.
because there's a question that I wanted to ask you, and I wanted to ask you before I forget. And I remembered when I took a drink of my drink, and that was that you call yourself the Dry Apologist, and your picture on both your Twitter and on your YouTube channel shows you in front of a beverage case. And I was curious if that was a play on Dry Apologist, that you need a beverage to watch you.
Yeah, there's multiple reasons I named it that. More or less with my personality, and actually the picture was just it just happened to have beverages behind me. I honestly did not intend that, but it ended up working out, so I keep that. But yeah,
Okay, okay. I was just curious about that.
yeah.
Okay, getting back to the topic at hand, which is salvation. And we have a question from the chat from Clockwork Rex. What do we need saving from?
Yeah, so I look at it more, and not all Christians may agree with me on this. I look at it more not what do we need saving from, but more, I mean, you could phrase it that way, but we're more saved in the sense of preserved. So, like, I could save something in the sense, like, I save a quarter, but I could also save something like I save a kitten from being attacked. So, like, I think there are different ways. So I look at it more in the first sense that God is saving us, like, preserving us, but of course you could look at another way, we're being saved from damnation, but I don't I don't really look at it, I don't prefer to look at it like that, because I think that's more of a negative way of looking at it, but you could take either perspective, I guess.
Okay. One thing that I was curious about is you said that if people are not Catholic through no fault of their own, and I'm kind of curious as to what you mean by no fault of their own. Like, for example, me, when I was born, my parents were Catholic. I was baptized into the Catholic Church. Um, I did have a sort of first communion, and I say sort of because one day when I was around 6 or 7, my dad and I were at church alone, which means my older brother must have been sick and my mom must have been home with my siblings, because my dad and I didn't normally go to church, just the two of us. And when it came time for communion, he looked at me and said, "Would you like to have your first communion?" And I said, "Sure." And so he said, "Okay." And he told me what to do. And we went up and I had communion. And when we got back down, he sat down, he said, "There, you had your first communion." And so I don't know if that counts because we didn't do any kind of ceremony. The priest didn't know that it was my first communion. So I did have communion in the Catholic Church. I was baptized in the Catholic Church, but my parents also left the Catholic Church when I was 7, and I had no teaching in Catholic doctrine after age of 7. And my parents left the church over the issue of birth control. After they had 4 children, my parents decided that was enough children, and the church told them they couldn't use birth control, so they left the church. And an asexual atheist says, "You missed the party." Yes, I missed the party. I was rather jealous because my older brother had first communion and he had a big party, and I didn't. But my younger siblings didn't even get a first communion. So although my sister eventually did, because she eventually became Catholic, and she went through catechism and confirmation and all that so that she could have a Catholic wedding. But anyway. So I was essentially raised outside of the church, and I converted to Protestantism at the age of 16. Now, I have since left the Protestant church because I find their theology absolutely inconsistent and incompatible with reality. So if I find the teaching of the church to be incompatible with reality, is my unbelief then through no fault of my own?
Yeah. So I don't think it's something that we could know for sure. So I think if you're seeking what's true, it may your unbelief may be through no fault of your own, but it could be that you're putting up a barrier. And I'm not saying you are. I don't know. Like, I don't know if I'm, like, again, I'm not going to say, well, I'm saved for sure. So the Catholic position is going to be you can lose your salvation, you can regain it again, and we don't really know. We can say these are good signs, like if you are a practicing Catholic and you're receiving the sacraments and you're living a charitable life, those are good signs that you're on the right path, but it's not foolproof. So yeah, we just don't know, would be my view.
In your view, does God control who is saved?
Yeah, so I know that you had a discussion about that a couple of weeks ago, which I listened to, and I think that it's twofold. So I don't think that God is going to override somebody's free will and make them be saved. So in that sense, I think a person is in control. But I do think that if it wasn't for God creating us and opening the door to salvation, we wouldn't be able to have that. So in that sense, he is in control. So I think it's twofold. So the analogy I like to use is it's like, am I in control of seeing? Well, I do have to open my eyes, but I'm not in control if there's light. I'm not in control if I have eyes. So I think so I look at it as in a synergistic sense, sometimes what's said. So I am ultimately in control of how I respond, but I do need God's help. I do need him to provide. So, however you want to interpret that as God being in control, that would be, my position.
Atheist God says, I had a Catholic wedding without being baptized. Actually, my younger brother had a Catholic wedding. I don't know if he was baptized. I don't know if he was not going to church and he had not had any of the other sacraments. But in order to have his Catholic wedding, they would not allow him to have it in the church. So they had a wedding with a priest, but it was not at the Catholic church. Whereas my sister had hers inside the Catholic Church, which is part of the reason why she went with the full deal, because that's what that church required. And Mr. Shadow Kitty says, one will never see truth, only perspective. That's an interesting perspective. Okay, so according to your view, God has partial sovereignty. He has some control over who goes to heaven and who doesn't, but not full control. Man has the ultimate decision of who goes to heaven and who doesn't.
Yeah, I would say that's fair. So I would say God has to open the door, but then we have to choose to walk through it, if you want to use that analogy.
Okay, so in your view, God is not a sovereign God that is the omniscient, omnipresent, benevolent being that is in control of the world. He's only in control of some things.
Well, with the first part, I definitely think he's omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent. But if you're saying is he only in control, I don't think I think he chooses not to override our free will. So, but I think that is a moral decision. Now, I do think that he must do what's right. So, in that sense, he does obligate himself. So, if you want to say that's giving up some control, you could say that. I wouldn't say that means. It depends upon how you define sovereign, though. So, if by sovereign you mean he determines everything, then I would say no, he's not sovereign over everything. But if by sovereign you mean does he have causal power over everything, is he sustain everything in existence, then yeah, he's sovereign. So it depends upon how you use the word, I would say.
Okay, and that's a fair question. And when I was using sovereign, I did not necessarily mean determinism, because I realize you are not a determinist, although I do use the word in that sense with some people because they are determinists. But with you, I was thinking more in terms of sovereign as in everything is within his power, not necessarily salvation, but like, say, if a car is going to crash, it is within his power to prevent that. If he wanted to end the pandemic immediately, that is within his power, he could do that.
Yeah, it's within his power. Now, it does get tricky because I think God has moral obligations, so it's not that he's obligated to something outside of himself, but because he's a morally perfect being, he is internally limited in that way by his obligation to his own perfection. So that does limit the actions he's going to carry out, but he does have maximal power. So that's where it gets tricky. But hopefully that makes sense. So does he have the power to stop a car? Yeah, he has the power to, but if there's a moral reason to not do something, he's not going to do it. So that's where it gets tricky.
Do you think a morally perfect being can commit genocide?
I don't. So, and I know where you're going to go with the question. So I don't take a literalistic view of all the things of the Old Testament. I think, we could get into like biblical inspiration, but no, I don't think a morally perfect being would commit or command genocide, no. And obviously, I know where you're going to go with it, but yeah.
So how do you see the flood story then? That it's just a story?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, like, even if that was not about, like, say there was nothing morally troublesome. I think the way that it's written, I think it's probably not like purely historical. I think it's more of like a legendary type account, but obviously there are other difficulties in the Old Testament as well. And yeah, I would just have to say that, yeah, I don't think that those are pure history. I think that those are things that's kind of legend mixed with maybe some history, but certainly I don't think that any story that depicts God commanding violence, at least towards an innocent person, is going to be something God actually commanded. I'm going to look at those more as like legends that God is, working through. There could be some lesson in it, but does not represent what God actually commanded. I recognize a lot of Christians will disagree with that perspective, but it seems more reasonable to me. So,
Okay. So the whole story of Joshua conquering the promised land, that's pretty much just legend.
yeah, and even I mean, there's even like the archaeological data. Apparently, I mean, I'm not an expert at all, but suggests that that's probably not
You're
at least
absolutely
pure
right.
history. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, just from a moral standpoint, I have trouble taking that as history. So yeah. And I mean, the way I would incorporate it, it doesn't totally get off the hook, but I would look at those as like, the flood is kind of a foreshadowing of, baptism. So like in the Old Testament, God purges out the evil. In the New Testament, that gets fulfilled that God baptizes of sin. Now that does not at all get rid of the problem, but that would be kind of a way I would reinterpret it to say like, well, there's some value here. It kind of points towards Christ in this way, but yeah, I don't think that the stories are history, at least in the pure sense.
Ricardo Oliveira says that you are basically saying that God is subject to his own existence and hence is not omnipotent, or he is subject to morality and hence he is not omniscient.
Yeah. So, subject to it. Yeah, I don't think that those things would entail that he's not omnipotent. Tricky, philosophical problem, which I'm happy to work through. But I would define omnipotent as having maximal power. So God has a power as a being could have, and omniscience, I would say, is just knowing every fact that can be known. And I mean, I think that he knows all the moral facts and every other fact that could possibly be known. So he's omniscient. So that's how I would approach that.
Okay. I'm sure you are well aware of the scandals of the sex abuse of priests in the Catholic Church. Okay. If God is omnibenevolent and is able to prevent that if he so chooses, how can a God who is moral, benevolent, and powerful enough to stop such actions just ignoring that and letting it happen?
Yeah, so that's obviously a really challenging question. So, yeah, I mean, with the problem of evil, I mean, obviously there's different routes. I mean, one could take, and it's obviously still going to be a difficult question. I mean, I have a complicated, worked out theodicy that I could work through, but basically to give you the gist, unless you really want me to hammer down the details, I don't think that. I think it has to do with free will, but it also has to do with the fact that if God so the way I explain it is if he made a perfect universe where he's in total control of all the laws and everything, then it's going to be a perfect world, but people are also going to be forced to be in a perfect relation with him and others, and I'm going to argue that that is forcing that relation, so he has to create a world where the laws and everything is not fully conformed to what I say his mind or his intellect and will, but then that is going to reduce his sovereignty in that regard. And I recognize there's a lot more explanation. I have a long video on my channel about it, but that's in the gist. That's the route I would take. Now, other Christians might say something else, but so I would say that he has. So to get to the root of your question, he has the power in the sense that he possesses the power to stop the action, but given these wider moral reasons, he's actually he's morally unable to always intervene in the world. That's a tricky dichotomy, but that's the position that I would take in responding to that.
But why can't God, find a way without violating free will to still accomplish that purpose. For example, suppose there is a priest whose intent is to go and molest an altar boy. Why can't God just simply make it so his car doesn't work? That doesn't affect his free will. He still has the free will to decide that he wants to molest the altar boy. He just takes away his capability.
Yeah, I agree with that response. So I don't think the free will response on its own does get around, does get around the issue. That's where I take this more wider response. So I call it the perfect will theodicy. It's a theodicy I've come up with. Not to say you'll find it convincing or other people, but what I argue is that the laws of the universe, I call it the system of laws, so the system of physical laws, it needs to be fully conformed to God's mind in order for God to intervene however he chooses. But he can't start out the world that way. Otherwise, again, this is what I argue, that it would force people into a perfect relation with him, but he's not going to do that. So he gives up sovereignty over some of the universe or the laws, and then that actually limits his interventions within the world. And because it's not fully conformed to his mind. So I agree, if we were just talking about free will, that would, I do think with this theodicy that they can explain why God wouldn't intervene. But anyways, hopefully that addressed at least my position.
I don't really see it as doing so because, you went back to the whole issue of free will, and I really wasn't asking about free will. I was asking about ability. One can take one's ability without taking away one's free will.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to do so much. Yeah, I mean, it gets complicated. I know. So if we want to get into the problem of evil, I'm happy to. I know that you had said originally you didn't want to talk about that topic, but
Yeah,
it
I
has to do
didn't.
with, right. Yeah, I don't want to dodge it, but I have a video where I go through step by step how the theodicy works. But basically, I don't think that God I don't think it's a matter of him not being able to override to turn off the car or something because that would violate the priest's free will. It's because God's interaction with the universe as a whole is limited. So even turning off the car could be something God is limited from doing. Is more of the
So then
perspective I'm
God
coming
is
from.
not omnipotent. There's a lot of things that he can't do because that would violate the overall picture.
Yeah. Well, it gets into how you define omnipotence. So I take this view of, God as maximal power, but it works alongside his moral obligations. And since I'm arguing he has these wider moral obligations, then that limits how he's interacting with the world. I mean, I think I'm just going to have to defer. If you haven't watched my video on it, I'm going to have to punt to that because otherwise my perspective is going to not make a lot of sense unless I spend a lot of time unpacking it. But
Okay.
I don't want to dodge it, but
That's okay. We'll move on to this question from asexual atheist. Do you insist on transparency within the parish that you attend in order to ensure that children are safe?
yeah, I mean, it depends upon what they mean by transparency, but in general, yeah, I would say so. I mean, I'm in favor of anything that's going to keep people safe. I mean, for example, I think the confessional should be open air or translucent. I don't think, at least I'm in favor. I don't think they should have private confessionals, but yeah, so if that's what they're getting at, then yeah, I agree.
Okay. Going back to the free will, do you believe that the story of the conversion of the Apostle Paul is literally true?
Oh, sorry, it cut out for a second.
That's okay. I saw you froze up. What I
Yeah.
asked you is, do you believe in the literal truth of the conversion story of Paul?
Yeah.
You do?
It depends upon what they mean by literal truth. I recognize there are different in the, I would
Do
say,
you
in the minute
believe that?
details, like between Acts and in the epistles. So,
Okay.
yeah,
Do you believe that Paul was on the road to Damascus and that Jesus made a personal appearance to him and asked him why he was persecuting him and that this led to the conversion of Paul?
yeah.
Okay. how is that not an overriding of Paul's free will to choose not to follow God?
Yeah, so I think that God can, um, make invitations, but then somebody, like I think Paul could have gone back to his old ways. Of course, that's an influence upon Paul if Christ appears to him, but he could say, no, that was just a hallucination. Everyone, I don't think that forced Paul to become a follower of Jesus, but of course, it definitely has an impact for sure.
Okay. Do you think that God knows what it is that intellectually keeps any person from following him and doing whatever it is he wants them to do?
Yeah.
Okay. If God knows what it is that keeps me from believing in him, and he is capable of appearing to me personally and telling me, I am real, here I am, I want you to follow me, and that is not a violation of my free will because it wasn't for Paul, why does God not do that for everyone?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm inclined to think, so to go back to my response from earlier, I don't think the fact that somebody is not, I don't know if we cut out for a second.
You did
That means
just
they're
for a
definitely
bit.
lost. So the fact that, you're not following Christ explicitly doesn't mean that you're not going to be saved. So I don't necessarily look at it as a salvation matter in that regard. So the conversion of Paul, I look at it more was in regards to um, establishing the. Sorry, what was that?
You look at the conversion of Paul as
I think
establishing
we
what?
cut out.
You see the conversion of
Okay,
Paul
yeah,
as
we're cutting out a
establishing
little bit.
what?
As hopefully you can hear me, but I look at it as establishing the. Yeah, I look at that as establishing the early church. So that was, I think, why it was essential for Paul to be converted. But I don't look at it as a salvation matter. Like if a person doesn't become an explicit Christian, then they're definitely not going to be saved. So hopefully that makes sense. So I don't.
Okay,
So I agree that God could do more to convert you on the spot, but I don't think that means you're lost, is what I'm saying.
okay. But you realize that I don't believe in God at all, right? And I think we've lost. Are you back?
Yeah, it cut out
We
a
have
little
a
bit.
bad, yeah,
Yeah, we have a bad connection.
we do.
I could try to leave and come back. I think I heard you
Okay, why
say
don't
you
you do
don't
that?
believe in God at all. Is that what you said?
Right. I don't believe in God at all, hence my name, Godless Granny. I do
Okay,
not
I'll
believe that
leave and
God.
come back, and hopefully that helps a little
Okay,
bit.
I'll just talk to the audience. Um, Caleb, the Dry Apologist, will be back in just a moment. We had a bad connection, and so he's going to see about reconnecting. And I'll look over a few of the questions in the chat at the moment. Atheist God asked, wouldn't God need to be moral to have a moral obligation? And I would definitely agree with that God would have to be moral to have a moral obligation. I'm not sure what your question is there, atheist God. Um, you also asked about hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and we did discuss that a little bit. He does not believe that most of the Old Testament stories are literal history, and he sees that any of the areas of the Old Testament where God is acting as an immoral person or in a way that is immoral, he believes that those are just legend and that those are not. Um, that those are not literal truths, and that's not necessarily God. That these are just legends about God that have grown up. Let's see. Ox asked. Oops. Ox said, "You would think that their God would make sure they had a good connection so the word could be heard." That's a very good point, Ox. Because yes. If there really was a God and he really was omnipotent and he was wanting his word to be heard on this channel through the Dry Apologist, then yes, that would definitely be something that he should do. Okay, and it looks like Caleb is almost back here. We've got a stream, but we don't have a picture yet. There we go. Hello again.
Okay, I'm back. I don't know if the connection's better.
Okay, well, we'll see. And if it is, we'll just keep going. And if it isn't, we'll just get in as much as we can. I guess I would like to get
Can you
to,
hear me?
yeah, I can hear you. Your video is freezing up occasionally, but for the most part, I'm very rarely having a problem hearing you. It's pretty much just the
Let
video
me
that is
see if I can
occasionally freezing.
stop my camera, maybe.
Okay. And Asexual Atheist said, "Welcome back."
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you. It's a little bit choppy.
Asexual Atheist actually likes you. He says you're a nice guest. Some believers can be very defensive. I would be interested in knowing, since you look at the Old Testament as being more legendary than anything else, how do you look at the story of the fall? Do you think that there was a point at which sin entered the world, that there was a time of a first sin for man?
Oh no, I think I heard what you said, but it's really choppy. Can you hear me though?
Yes, I can hear you just fine.
I don't know how long I'll be able to last because it's really choppy on mine. But I think you asked if there was like from Adam and Eve, and yeah, I'm agnostic on that point. So, um, yeah, I lean towards no, but I don't have a definitive stance. I just been different considerations from science and just theology. I'm inclined to think that there was not, but yeah, it's something I don't have a firm answer on. Of course, I do think there was, first sin, but, I lean towards thinking there wasn't a literal Adam and Eve.
Okay. But you do think that there was a first sin at some point?
Yeah.
Okay. So when that first sin occurred, did all um, did all humanity sin as a result of that? Did that affect all of humanity in some way?
Yeah, so I know some Protestants take the view that like everybody sinned in Adam, and I don't hold that view, but the traditional, at least Catholic view has been, that a sin nature is passed on, and that doesn't force somebody to sin, but it is an inclination to sin. So whether you want to take that as a literal passing on or more just like an evolutionary, inheritance, I kind of favor the latter interpretation, but a lot of Christians won't agree with me on that. But I think we have an inclination to sin, but I don't think that we're personally held accountable for what the first humans did. I think people are judged for their own personal sins or wrongdoings, if you want to use that word.
Okay. But you do think that humans are inclined to sin because of this sin nature?
Right, yeah.
Okay. Um, and that sin nature is something that we have because of the first sin that occurred.
So that's where I'm agnostic. I really don't like that perspective, but I recognize I'm in the minority in saying that even within my own tradition. I'm inclined to just think so like the Catholic Church technically doesn't have a official position on that, but the tradition has certainly favored that view. Um, oh, so I'll of it.
I'm sorry, I didn't
So I
catch
think
that
that
last.
basically my view. Oh, so basically, I think my view on this, I think, is very secular friendly. I think that we have a sinful inclination, but I think basically that's just because we're evolved mammals that, you know, we have, we're selfish, greedy, etc.
Okay. Okay.
It's because of the sin of the first humans. But again, I'm agnostic on it. I don't know for sure, but I more have an inclination to do evil, but I'm not inclined to think it's really because of the first humans. But again, that's just kind of my thinking on it.
Okay. Do you think that Jesus experienced a bodily resurrection?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And do you think that he ascended into heaven? I'm not sure if we've got a lag or if you're still there. Um,
Creed, I'll definitely take all of that literally. So
okay,
if you're
I
familiar.
caught Creed will take all of that literally. I didn't catch anything
Can
before
you hear
that.
me?
Yeah, I can now. We seem to have a bad connection. Mr. Shadow Kitty says, Dry has just ascended. Oh. Well, I don't know if Dry is still there. If you are, where I was going with this is if Jesus rose from the dead in bodily form and then ascended into heaven, my first question would be, did his body also ascend into heaven, or did only his spirit ascend into heaven? And if his body ascended into heaven, where is it now? And if only his spirit ascended into heaven, where is his body? It should still be here.
Yeah, I definitely think his body and soul ascended into heaven. So obviously, physically that's hard to. I mean, he didn't just go up into the clouds because then he'd keep going into space. Yeah, I don't know how that works exactly. I mean, I think at some point he was, transported to, the heavenly universe. If you want to speak that way, I don't know at what point in his
So you
ascension that
believe in the
happened, but I think
multiverse.
that would just have to be the case.
You believe in the
Um,
multiverse.
yeah, I'm open to a multiverse. Yeah, I'm open to a multiverse idea, but yeah, I would say like the heavenly state. I wouldn't say it's like literally another universe like ours, but whatever it is, I mean, it transcends, space. I mean, at least it transcends the type of universe we're in, but a kind of state like that, yeah.
Okay. So do you think that our universe and whatever universe Jesus's body is in right now, do you think those are the only two universes that exist, or could there be other universes as well?
Yeah, I think that there could be. I mean, we just have no way of knowing. I mean, I think it's simpler to think God only created this universe, but I don't
Well, he had
know.
to have also created the universe where Jesus is now, so he had to have created at least two.
Right, right. If you want to call that a universe, then yeah.
Well, if it's not a different universe, if it's within this universe, then Jesus' body should be somewhere in space in this universe.
Yeah. Well, I guess I just hesitate to call it a universe because just in the sense that it's not like he's on Earth on another planet in some other galaxy, like in a different universe, and just like ours. But yeah, some kind of space time outside of our universe. And yeah, if you want to call that a universe, then yeah, that's fine. I just don't know what it's like. Is the only reason I hesitate. But yeah, if you want to call that, then sure,
Okay.
that could be a universe.
If 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 the multiverse exists, could sin exist on one of these in one of these other universes?
Yeah, I mean, if there are humans, like I'm open, or I mean, well, okay, I should qualify. By humans, I just mean an intelligent animal or being kind of like us.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I'm open to the idea of there are aliens in our universe. So pineapple on Jesus sinful.
He's being
Yeah, so
silly.
I'm open. I'm open to the idea of. I mean, I don't know what God's plan of salvation would be for like alien beings. It could
That's where,
be
yeah, that was where I was going to
right.
ask next, is did
I
Jesus have to
figured.
die for these other universes? Does he died multiple times on multiple universes?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. So I'm open to that ability. Or I mean, I know another speculation is his death on, in our universe atones for all rational beings, and I don't know. Yeah, I'm agnostic on that. Of course, I think it could go either way.
Do you think that the sin nature that humans have is a genetic trait?
Yeah. 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 So going back to my view on that earlier, I'm inclined to think it's a genetic trait, but yeah, I'll say it's a genetic trait. Sure. I don't think it's something
Okay.
we can locate, but like it's. I'm perfectly fine for like the sin nature having a naturalistic explanation. Being evolved creatures, we're going to have inclinations to selfishly hoard our materials and so on, and you could call that the sin nature. But again, I'm agnostic on the exact details of that.
Okay. Um, if this you do recognize that genetic traits are not always passed from parent to child, that children have different DNA from their parents, correct?
Right.
Okay. So if the sin nature is a genetic trait, wouldn't some humans be born without it?
No, I don't think that some humans would be born with that. So I guess by genetic trait, I don't think it's like I think it's like more basic, and I don't know enough about genetics, so I'm not gonna debate it. But it's more of something that's within the fabric of the matter itself. So I would say I would call it. It could be a material trait, but I guess if you're going to say is it located to a specific DNA strand, I would say
No, I
no.
wasn't going to go there because,
Okay.
yeah, I also do not know enough about genetics to be able to locate something specifically on a gene. But if you're going to go with it that it's an inherited trait, then there is nothing genetic that every human being shares with every other human being. We all have different traits, and any trait that is passed from parent to child is something that can mutate in a child, and that's why children are born different from their parents. And so if it's a genetic trait, it would have to be something that a child could be born without as well.
Yeah. I've never really thought about that question, but I'd be inclined to say that it's more basic. Like it's something within the perhaps within the matter itself. So any human is going to have it unless God prevents that. But so I guess it gets down to what somebody means by genetic. But yeah, I don't have. I think it's more metaphysical. So we could say it's material, but maybe not. And I know you're saying you weren't
So
getting
you think
into
the
details
sin
about.
nature is material? It's a material thing?
Well, that's where it gets tricky. So not necessarily, but it kind of gets into a concept in philosophy of a telos or teleology. So I think it's kind of a tendency of a of an animal. It's going to have this kind of tendency, and so, but you could call that material if you wanted. It's yeah. I mean, it eludes me. I don't know the nature of it. I think it's a tendency that animals and humans have, but I don't know where it blends between material and immaterial is gonna get tricky. I mean, we could call it immaterial. I mean, it could be part of the soul as well. I mean, I really don't know. I don't have
Okay.
like a
I'm
firm
gonna
position on the origin of it.
Okay, I'm going to put that conversation on hold for just a moment
All
because
right.
we have a joke question here that is rather funny. And Lord Sasquatch wants to know, do you believe in me?
Um, what are they asking? Do I believe that they're
Do
a
you believe in
person, or do I believe
Sasquatch?
in sketch?
You,
No,
you, you
I
could
don't.
answer it any way you want because the question is obviously a joke. So
Yeah.
you could take it any way you want. You could offer a joke answer.
No, I don't believe in Sasquatch.
Okay. Do you ever watch America's Funniest Home Videos?
I mean, yeah, I've seen it.
They had
Regularly.
in this past episode, they had a practical joke where a father took his kids on a hayride, and the children's uncle was dressed in a Sasquatch costume. And they went out specifically looking for Sasquatch. And when they saw him, the father jumped off of the hayride and ran up to Sasquatch, and Sasquatch threw him into the ground, and the kids were panicking until their uncle pulled off the mask and showed that it was really just him. It was hilarious.
Well, I'll try to look that up.
Okay, getting back to our conversation. Okay, so you believe that a person has a soul.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay, and do you believe that that soul is a physical part of a person, or is that something that does not have physical, a physical entity to it?
Yeah, I think that the soul is immaterial or spiritual.
Okay. Do you think it is ingrained within a person's personality?
Um, yeah, that gets tricky too. So I don't have a firm position on that because a personality could be. I think it's partly, of course, from the brain and genetics and upbringing and so on, which is material. But I do think that the mind itself is immaterial. So there's kind of that merging of the material and immaterial. And I don't know. So it's kind of, I think it's kind of both in that sense.
Ox says that Sasquatch are really Wookiees hunting slaves to sell to the Huta cartel on Dramenkos.
All right.
Um, okay. This is a good question. I was wondering if I should bring this up, and I wasn't sure if I should, but since Florida Line has brought it up, I will. Florida Line says that you recently had a video concerning Mary's Immaculate Conception, that she was
Mm-hmm.
sinless. Do you believe that Mary was sinless?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I do. So yeah, that would be Catholic teaching on that, which of course most Protestants won't agree with. But yeah, that's my view.
Okay. Why do you think that Mary brought a sin offering to the temple at the birth of Jesus if she was sinless?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I've ever been posed that question before. I would say that it was a matter of custom. I don't know that Mary would have necessarily even known that she was sinless. Like Jesus was baptized, even though he was sinless, and so I think it was a matter of custom. They went around declaring themselves sinless, but that's how I would approach that at least.
So you're not sure that Mary knew that she was sinless?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, I don't, I mean, she may have known that, but I don't know if she would have necessarily known it or not.
Do you believe that Mary had other children besides Jesus?
I don't. So, yeah, I mean, that would again be a Catholic view that a lot of Protestants won't agree with, but I think Jesus was her only child, yeah.
So when the Bible says that Jesus' mother and brothers and sisters came, why does it say that when if he doesn't have any brothers and sisters?
Yeah, so there are different positions on that. So, one would, in order to at least reconcile it, so one would be that the brothers and sisters could be translated as cousins. I don't know Greek, and I've heard that argument is suspect, but that is one position. Another is that Joseph could have had a previous marriage and his wife died, and then those are half siblings. I'd probably favor that view more, but those would be two ways to reconcile that.
Well, they would have to be half siblings anyway because Joseph wasn't Jesus' father.
Right, but they would be half siblings in the sense of they're not Mary's children, biological children.
If Jesus was conceived by an immaculate conception, how is he male? Where did the Y chromosome come from?
Now, I do. This is trivial in some sense, but the Immaculate Conception actually only refers to Mary's conception. But I know what you're getting at, the virgin conception of Jesus. Um, so I don't know on that, of course. I think it's. I'm inclined to think perhaps God ex nihilo created the other chromosomes within Mary, but that's the answer. That'd be the position I take, but.
Okay. Um, let's see. I'm going back to the list of questions that I had written down as things to remind me to talk about. And I think we've actually covered most of the questions that I had, although, I'm still really confused about the whole, if God is perfectly benevolent and actually wanted people to believe in him and follow him, and it's not a violation of free will for him to appear to Paul, how can it be a violation of free will for him to do the same thing for everyone else?
Yeah, and I don't think it would be a violation of free will. I think that there are different avenues one could take. So I think typically God works in rather subtle ways, and that's found like in scripture, like passage with I think it's Elijah, and like he doesn't hear God in the earthquake, and you probably know what story I'm talking about, but he hears like God in the wind. So I think typically God works in rather subtle ways. So doesn't usually do like demonstrative miracles and appearances and such. So I think taking that route, and along with the consideration that I don't think somebody's going to not be saved because they don't explicitly become a Christian or Catholic, and I think that's one avenue. I do think also the theodicy that I defend, and I'm happy to come back on or have a further conversation if you want to watch my video on it first, just because otherwise it's going to be too confusing to explain. I think that can help too, since I do have this view that God is more limited in how much he interacts within the world. But both of those approaches, I think, can help in responding to that hiddenness problem. But ultimately, I mean, it is still mysterious. I'm not saying I have the definitive answer, but from my own reflection, that would be what I find to be the most plausible answer.
Florida Line asks an excellent question. Why doesn't God just create everyone to be sinless like Mary?
Right. Yeah, I mean that's a good question. Honestly, I mean, of course, it's a difficult question, and so what I explained in the video on the Immaculate Conception is that so Mary needed to be created without a sin nature in order to so this is a common misconception. It's not because Jesus would have necessarily inherited a sin nature, because then that pushes the question back, well, what about Mary's parents, and so on. It's because Jesus being divine, at least this is my argument, Jesus being divine, he has a sinless origin in his divine nature, and he also needs a sinless origin in his human nature. And again, I'm not saying that that's convincing to everybody, but that's the route that I take. So it's actually essential for the hypostatic union and the incarnation for Mary to not have a sinful nature. But it's not essential. I mean, she's the only one who gave birth, conceived, God in the flesh. So, the rest of us don't need that. But, so that's the short answer there.
Okay, but if a sinless world would be a better world, why not make us sinless? Why not make us
No, I
without
mean
that sin
that's
nature?
right. No, that's a perfectly fair question. Again, I'm gonna punt to my problem of evil video, and I'm happy to come back on and discuss it. But I do want you to watch it first, otherwise we're gonna get sidetracked. But that's how I'm gonna punt to that video.
Okay. All right. Do you believe in the transubstantiation?
Right, yeah. And so just to clarify for the audience, of course, that would be the view that at the Mass, the bread and wine literally becomes the body and blood of Christ, but it keeps the appearance of bread and wine, so it'll taste and smell and look like bread and wine, but we hold that as Catholics, that it really is the body and blood of Christ. And yeah, I do hold that view.
Okay. And if it really is the body and blood of Christ, should it not be, should a person, a chemist, not be able to go to any Catholic church on any given Sunday and collect a small sample of communion wine and communion bread after it's been blessed and do an analysis on it and find that it is human blood and human flesh?
So no, because it still keeps the physical appearance of wine and bread. So it's not empirically detectable. So how that works, again, I don't totally know. Say God, miraculously keeps the physical appearance, even though it really is physically, even though we don't tend to say physically, but it really is physically the flesh and blood of Christ. But it's not something you'd be able to see. Again, it's not falsifiable in that sense. It's a matter of faith. But no, a chemist won't be able to detect it. Now, there have been some reports of it really visibly becoming the flesh and blood. That's not a matter of doctrine, so a Catholic can be agnostic on whether that's really, those miracles are real or hoaxes. But, so hopefully that
Okay.
addresses.
How do you define what a substance is? And by that I mean, okay, the definition of what is a hydrogen atom. And I let's see, hydrogen comes first on the periodic table, then helium, or do I have it backwards?
Oh, I don't
So,
know.
okay. If I get this wrong, someone in the chat correct me. Hydrogen is the first atom on the periodic table. It has one proton and one electron, and that is the characteristic that makes it hydrogen. If it had two protons, it would not be hydrogen, it would be helium, because that is the physical property that defines it as hydrogen, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And yes, that sounds
So
correct, but I'm not.
if the bread at communion does not have the chemical properties of human flesh, how can you say it actually is human flesh when it has none of the physical properties of human flesh?
Right. So in that's where I think it's a miracle that God keeps it appearing to our senses with the physical properties. So you could call it whatever you want, an illusion or whatever, but it looks like it's going to have all the physical components to our senses, even though it really has these other physical components.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to do three things at once. I'm reading what's going on in the chat so that I can keep up with any questions or comments that I need to highlight. And I'm checking for anything else that I need to be aware of it. I did not hear all of your answers. So if you don't mind, could you repeat that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I keep miracle in that you would call it like a mirage or illusion, whatever you want, but to all it's going to have all the physical appearances of bread and wine down to the molecular structure, even though it really does have the molecular structure of Christ's flesh and blood. Again, it's a miracle, so God's making it appear one way, but it's not that way.
So you're saying that the bread does have the molecular structure of flesh and not the molecular structure of the bread?
In actuality, but again, that's not something that scientists are able to detect. So to our senses, to our microscopes and so on, it's going to have the molecular structure of bread and wine. But I'm saying in actuality, it doesn't.
So you're saying that scientists microscopes and all of our scientific tools can be fooled because something can be one thing and have all the properties of one thing, but no, it's really something else.
Well, yeah, because I mean, it's a miracle.
Well, how do we know that anything is what we say it is? That if everything we know from science can be fooled.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we have like Cartesian certainty, but all things being equal, we should take things as they are. But, on the basis of faith, again, I wouldn't, if you're not a committed Catholic, you're not going to believe the bread and wine is Jesus' body and blood. But on the basis of faith, they're going to believe that God can do that. But yeah, all
And
things
and
being equal, yeah, go ahead.
I can accept that. I can accept that. Catholics take it on faith that this has gone through a transubstantiation process, and I'm perfectly fine with Catholics accepting on faith that this is what's going on. But I find it incredible that you would claim that something actually has the chemical properties of one thing, but if you test it using scientific instruments, that the scientific instruments will tell you a completely different story.
Right. Well, it's because it's a divide, I would say, between the metaphysical and the empirical. So, I mean, so the historical explanation is, and why it's called transubstantiation, is there's this divide between substance and accident. So substance would be like what the thing is, but the accidents would be like the particular features. So you could say like an accident of my hair is it's brown, but it could be blonde if I dye it or whatever. But the substance is the hair. The difficulty, I think, with that explanation is that when you get down to the molecular components, my hair is those molecules. So that's where I just don't know. I think that I do have to say that the molecular components really are Christ's flesh, even though God causes it to still like it's bread. But I understand that if you're not committed to that doctrine, you're not going to believe that's actually what's taken place. And I get that.
Okay. Jen with one N asks, would a priest be able to tell the difference between a transubstantiated piece of bread and a piece of bread that has not been blessed?
So yeah, I don't think that priests have like a super detection power. So but we could talk about any person, and I think it's possible, not by sight, but some Catholics can feel the presence, and you could say, well, that's just their mind playing a trick on them. But I know of Catholics who will say they can feel entering into a room that Jesus is present in the Eucharist in that room, even though maybe nobody even knew that. And again, I'm not saying that that will convince somebody, but that would be a way in which maybe the priest could tell, but not through sight.
Okay. Okay. Now, you said that, a scientist wouldn't be able to detect the actual molecular structure of a blessed piece of bread as being flesh because of lack of belief. But what if the chemist was a Catholic chemist who firmly believed that this was flesh? Would he then be able to see that the molecular structure was flesh?
Okay, so I want to clarify. It's their lack of faith that they can't see it. It's that nobody can see it, right? Unless God gives them that detection. So even a Catholic chemist won't be able to tell with their microscope. They could maybe feel that within their soul, but they wouldn't be able to tell unless God made it visible to them, or made it visible to everybody. That would be the only way you could tell, by looking.
Okay. So if no one can tell from looking, no one can tell from chemical structure, how do you know it is actually happening?
Yeah, I mean it's on faith, so we would trust that. Again, not all Christians interpret it the same way, but we would say, well, this is what Jesus teaches. This is what in Scripture. This is what the Church teaches, and we accept that authority. So it's on faith.
Is everything that the church teaches correct?
Yeah, I believe so, but there can be clarifications in some of the details through history, and there are some examples of that. So I would say, so the substance or essence of the teachings are correct, but that doesn't mean that there can't be qualifications later on in history, and I can give some examples of that.
Okay. Well, the first example that it comes to mind, of course, is the selling of indulgences.
Hmm.
That was definitely a practice of the Catholic Church that, that for a donation you could sin all you wanted, and the more you sin, the bigger the donation that requires to cover it up. I assume
Yeah,
you don't agree with that.
well, yeah, so that's a tricky issue, and I'm honestly not the expert on the history of indulgences, so I can just expound upon what I know. The church does still teach indulgences. It's just that there was a corruption of it in the Middle Ages, which is of course what led in part to the Reformation. But it's never, or at least it never should have been, that you can then sin all you want. It's that you can do acts of reparation for sins, and part of that could have been, well, you can make a donation, and that can be a good thing to donate to a charity, or an you could donate to a church, but it can also be a profiteering business. That was part of what was going on. And there were people saying like, well, this is a relic of a saint, and maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but they were making a business out of it. And that's of course a corruption of the idea that, like, well, we can do good things to draw us closer to God, and that can lessen our time in purgatory. But it was a corrupted practice, but it still is taught that you can do indulgences.
Okay. Do you believe in purgatory?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. So you think that when people die, they go to purgatory to pay for their sins, and once their sins are paid for, then they go into heaven? Is that how it works?
So, yeah, there's not a lot that's officially taught on purgatory. So, it's possible that somebody wouldn't have to go to purgatory. For example, like Mary wouldn't have had to gone to purgatory because she was sinless, and it could be, that saints don't have to go to. And by that, I just mean like a canonized saint doesn't have to go to purgatory. But yeah, I would say probably most people who are saved are going to spend some time in purgatory, and it's to purify a person. So say you have some unreconciled, whatever it might be within your history, you have things that are imperfect, and it's to go there to become perfect, to enter heaven.
I picked up on this because you'd mentioned it, and I do want to get back to this. I have some more questions about it. But there was
Hmm.
also a question from Atheist God that I think is a really good question, and I would like to address it. And there really needs to be a prelude question to this. And he asks, why is suicide a sin if it isn't in the Bible? But I think we need to first prelude that question with, do you think that suicide is a sin?
Yeah, so that's a really tricky topic, and I don't want to misspeak on it. So my position would be that it is a wrong action, but since it's always based upon culpability, I wouldn't, while I could say this is a wrong action, I wouldn't be able to say that person sinned, because I would have to know their mental states. Is that person insane? Is that person, what is their understanding of the world? And ultimately only God can say, you sinned, but a person can still say, it's likely this was a sin. So if a person commits suicide, did they sin? I wouldn't be able to say that. All I can say is, from my perspective, that's a wrong action to take because they're taking their life. But I'm not going to be able to say that person sinned or not. I hope that addressed it,
Well,
or
a little
clarified.
bit, but it seems to me like victim blaming. Because a person who commits suicide usually does so because they are depressed and they have a mental illness. And if
Hmm.
somebody does something as a result of an illness, that they really are not in control of their own actions. And if they are not in control of their own actions, then how are they to blame for what they have done?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if they're not in control of their actions, then culpability would be diminished. So yeah, I don't think it would be a sin at that point. But I just can't say one way or another. So I'm not going to say, you know,
Okay.
one way or another. I'm just going to say is I don't think it's a good action to take, but whether or not it's a sin is not for me to I'm not going to be able to weigh in on that, whether somebody sinned or not, because I don't know their mental state.
Okay. We've got a question from Almost a Doctor. He said the idea of not being happy with contraception was actually a response to the Black Death to help stimulate population growth. Was that God inspired?
So I don't know the history on the relation between contraception and the Black Death. I mean, there definitely was a tradition against contraception before that. I mean, it goes back pretty early in the church. And so the traditional understanding has been that sexual acts have two ends to them. So the union of the spouse and to be open to creating new life, and that it would be wrong for somebody to work against either of those. And I recognize not everybody agrees with that, but that would be the reason why. Now, could the Black Death have encouraged a sort of a fever of being against contraception? Yeah, I mean, that's historically possible, but it definitely was a teaching before that.
Okay. Do you believe that contraception is wrong?
I do, yeah. And I recognize that's highly controversial, but yeah, I mean, I do accept the church teaching on that, so I do.
If a family has all the children that they can afford, and if a woman has all the children that she knows that she is physically able to take care of, how do you demand that she have more children?
Yeah, so I wouldn't demand that she has more children. So, and again, I know I'm stepping in, so you're hitting me with the most controversial questions at this point. But, natural family planning, I know that that is not necessarily viewed favorably, but at least statistically, it has been shown to be effective at avoiding conception, but not preventing conception would be the distinction that the church makes. And of course, both are, or at least some forms of contraception and natural family planning are recent discoveries. But yeah, that's how I would look at it. Is I would recommend natural family planning, and but yeah, I wouldn't say that they're. So the church doesn't say that a family has to have as many children as biologically possible, but rather that that a couple cannot actively prevent conception.
Well, isn't family planning also preventing conception?
So by preventing conception, I mean, and I don't want to be graphic, but like actively preventing insemination. So
Okay.
natural family planning doesn't introduce a barrier in that regard.
That's true. Yes, I would agree with you there. I was just thinking, that the goal is the same to prevent pregnancy, and
To
so
avoid, yeah, I would say avoid pregnancy in both cases, but I would say one prevents and the other just avoids would be the distinction at least.
Mr. Shadow Kitty has a question. I'm not sure if it's a serious question or not. Is there a way to distinguish between when feels the presence of Jesus or when they are feeling a schizophrenic episode? Now, I don't think he's entirely serious on that question, but on the other hand, there is a serious aspect to that question, because I was a believer for 42 years. And during my time as a believer, there were times when I most definitely felt that I was feeling the presence of Jesus. And one of the times that was the strongest was when I visited Notre Dame in Paris. And I visited, and I was so moved by that visit that I came back again the following day, and I didn't feel it. And part of the reason that I really felt that it was the presence of God was because I felt it one time and I didn't feel it the other. However, the organ was playing the first time I was there, and it was not playing the second time it was there. And anyone who knows me really well knows that I do not listen to music, hardly at all. I almost never listen to music. And the reason is because music has such a profound emotional impression on me that I can listen to a sad song and be depressed for days. And so it's just better for me to, and there are certain songs, Bohemian Rhapsody is number one, that will make me suicidal. And so I just don't listen to music at all. And I think Mr. Shadow Kitty is right that not necessarily a schizophrenic episode, but what is there a difference between feeling the presence of Jesus and just having an emotional experience?
Um, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I don't think that we do know for sure. So I don't base my belief personally on religious experiences, but I know a lot of Christians do. But I can't say that it doesn't factor in at all. Um, so, like, I think an emotional experience, like listening to music, can be an encounter of God, but I recognize it can also be a natural response of the brain. And ultimately, I don't think that we do know for sure. I do think that the circumstances of it can raise the probability, though. So, like, if you felt that way and you were listening, to song in your room, then that might be more questionable than, like, say you had received communion. But at the same time, both of them could be explained naturally. So I don't think we can know for sure. Of course, how improbable the event is going to raise its likelihood that it's a miracle. Like if you see somebody's limb grow back, that's going to be, probably more likely to be interpreted miraculously than a feeling. But I do think that it's very I do think God can work through natural means. So if you really like organ music, God can work through that. But of course, it does make it more uncertain whether you were feeling the Holy Spirit or not. And I recognize that.
Atheist God says we haven't addressed abortion yet, and I don't want to go there. Let's not go there because that would we're going to be done in just a few minutes, and if we go there, we're going to end up here all night. But
Well,
I
I'm
just
happy
wanted
to
to
come
point out
back and
that
address.
what'd you say?
Oh, I said I'm happy to come back and address it. I already stepped into the hot water. So.
What I do want to go back to though is, well, first let's take Seraphin Hyde's question, then I want to go back to purgatory a little bit.
Okay.
Seraphin asked, so as a woman who cannot have children, should I not take contraceptives for medical reasons? In other words, are contraceptives wrong, period, or are they only wrong for birth control purposes?
Yeah, so not being a medical professional, I'm not going to comment on whether or not it has medical benefits or not. But yeah, I mean, if it's done for medical benefits and somebody can't have children, then I would say probably most moral theologians are going to say that it's permissible if it's done for the medical benefit. But again, I'm not going to be able to comment on whether or not it has that or not. But if it's done to prevent conception, then it would be immoral in the Catholic view.
Okay, now getting back to purgatory, you were saying that a person, goes to purgatory until their sins are paid for, and then they go into heaven. And so the first question is, then why did Jesus die?
Yeah, yeah. So I paid for, and I had a feeling you were going to go with, you were going to ask me that. So I think Jesus, and I don't really like using the word paid but I think he made the sacrifice for our sins, and that does ultimately bring us to reconciliation with God in general. But I do think we do still need to confess our particular sins, and I think that purgatory. I look at it more as it's for therapeutic reasons. So, like, say you have something that's holding you back from God, you go there to reconcile those differences personally. Now, traditionally, I mean, it probably has been more emphasized that it's about some kind of punishment, but I really don't look at it that way. And the church doesn't really have a lot of teaching on purgatory, but hopefully that made sense.
Okay. Do you think that hell is a place then? If we can become reconciled with God by going to purgatory, is there any reason for hell?
Yeah. Yeah, so I have a video on a possible perspective of hell that I think is a little more merciful. I'm not a universalist, but I do hope that everybody's saved. So I'm a hopeful universalist, but I don't take the view that I know everybody will be saved. 'cause I don't think we can know that. But yeah, I think ultimately, though, if somebody rejects God through their, and again, I'm not saying somebody who declares themselves an atheist. I'm talking about somebody who is an actively immoral person or actively refuses a relation with God, and that could be religious people too, then that person has severed their relation, and then hell is the place for them to go, because God's not going to force that relation with himself or with him and that person. So that's where I would say that the necessity of hell is. I think that hell is a place where God tortures people, but yeah.
Okay. That's good. That's fair. Jen with one N asks, are unbaptized babies in purgatory?
Yeah, so there is a distinction between purgatory and limbo. So limbo has never been an official teaching of the church, but limbo was a theory that unbaptized infants went to a place that was not heaven, but it was a peaceful existence. And the church never officially taught that, but it has been, now it teaches that that's not the case. So it was always a theory, and the church closed the door on that theory somewhat recently in the last couple of decades or so. But purgatory would be a place for somebody who needs to go because they have things to reconcile. So while it's not official teaching, I would take the view that an unbaptized infant who dies would not need to go to purgatory because they don't have any barriers between themselves and God. So I would say unbaptized infants who die are in heaven.
Okay. Okay. Jen with one N also asks, how can a relationship be with God? It seems rather one-sided. And I think what she's asking is, the believer prays, the believer reads their Bible, the believer goes to church, the believer fellowships with other believers, but we don't get anything from God. God doesn't talk to us. God supposedly gave us the Bible, but then kind of left us on our own for the last few thousand years.
Yeah, that gets back into the issue with hiddenness. So it's definitely an issue, and I think it's, in my mind, it's tightly woven with the problem of evil. So that'll get us back into that. But in that, I do think in this life, God is largely hidden, and he works within somebody's heart in very subtle ways. And of course, he can seem absent to somebody maybe their whole life. But I do think that he's sort of inviting people, and then heaven is ultimately where that relation manifests more fully. And of course, that's taken on faith. I do think I have some good reasons for my beliefs. So I don't think I hold to a blind faith, although somebody might think I do. But yeah, I hold a hope that God is drawing us into, that he is in a relation with us, but it's a more veiled relation.
Okay. We are getting very close to the end of our time, and so I'm going to start wrapping it up. And I first want to thank you very much for coming, Dry Apologist. I do think it was very brave of you. Not everyone is willing to come on an atheist channel and talk about their views, knowing that most of the questions are going to be, some of them are sarcastic, some of them are very difficult, and some of them are, just really hard to answer. But I thank you for being brave enough to come here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm happy to come back if you want to have me back on at some point. But yeah, I enjoy talking with people, especially people that I don't share the same views with, because I think that's more fun. But yeah, thanks for having me.
And did you have any closing thoughts that you wanted to express that you didn't get a chance to express at some point?
No, I think it was pretty clear. I'm sure some of the things I said aren't 100% clear, but if anybody wants to message me on Twitter, I'm pretty active on there. But yeah.
Okay. And the link to Dry Apologist's YouTube channel and to his Twitter Twitter handle are both in the description of the video. So if anyone would like to get in touch with him or go check out his videos, the links are available in the description. And the next thing I would like to ask is, Dry Apologist, can you tell us what you have coming up on your channel? Are there any specific plans that you have for any upcoming videos?
Oh, I just plan week by week. I probably will post a video soon, and I think I'm gonna have a discussion in a couple of weeks. But that's it's all in the works. So
Okay. And what I have coming up, I have a video in the works right now that is a response to Sean McDowell and Josh McDowell. Sean interviewed his dad, Josh, about the Ravi Zacharias scandal. And I was absolutely appalled at some of the things that Josh McDowell said as a result of this. And he thinks he is coming on with good comments, and yet really what he's ending up doing is victim blaming. So if you want to see Josh McDowell victim blaming, take a look at that when it comes out. That should be coming out either Friday or Saturday. And then next Tuesday's stream, I don't have anything specific planned, or do I? Let's see. No, I do not have anything specific planned for next Tuesday. But I know it will be a lighter stream. I've had a number of heavy things, and I'm just really in the mood for something light. So it's probably going to be more of a party atmosphere with just a few friends. And I definitely need to get Javier on. And so I will be inviting him soon. I just met him recently, and I would love to have him on. Then the next big thing that I have coming up is on April 13th at 7 p.m. Cirrus Skeptic, Shannon Q, Dave Warnock, and Junie the Apostate will be here for another episode of Why Are We Here, where we talk about what we do on our channels and why. And I want to say thank you to all of my patrons who are listed on the banner that's been scrolling down below. I want to say thank you to everyone in the chat who has made this conversation it has deepened it and expanded it. And thank you also to the Dry Apologist for coming and being so brave to come on here. And live your life. Bye.